Welcome to another edition of The Spotlight. Now, the group of 7 developed countries are considering a near-total ban on exports to Russia, and their ministers are now discussing the idea before a summit meeting in Japan next month. In their words, they are forming a united front against Russia. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev said on Sunday that Moscow would respond to such a move by terminating the Black Sea grain deal that enables vital exports of grain from Ukraine. While the tug of war continues, one may ask, how effective have the sanctions been so far, and who exactly is bearing the brunt? The situation has dragged on long enough thanks to Western arms pouring into Ukraine. For us to analyze that tonight in this edition of The Spotlight. And to do so, we are joined by Glenn Diesen, Professor of Political Science at the University of Southeastern Norway, joining us live from Oslo. Also, we have with us DeBar, activist and commentator, who is joining us from New York. Thank you very much to both of you, gentlemen. Let's begin with Professor Diesen, who's joining us from Oslo. Now, this near total ban on exports to Russia, it may sound simple on paper, but this goes against the very principles that Western economy is based on, concepts such as comparative advantage, absolute advantage. How are they even discussing that?
Well, I think it will have even wider problems because they're disrupting key supply chains. I mean, Russia is also connected to the rest of the world, so this is not just causing economic disruption in Russia as well as in the West, but also for the rest of the world. I don't think necessarily it's been thought through that well. Again, with the initial sanctions, as the assumptions were that Russia would crumble fairly quickly within a week or two. It's been now more than a year, and obviously it never happened. But I think it will eventually probably hurt the Europeans more than Russia and the United States for that sake. But the reason is not necessarily the great logic in it. It's this is the only solution we have left in the West now, among the NATO countries, because we made it very clear we do not want any peace. As Anthony Blinken said, any ceasefire is unacceptable. And meanwhile, as the Pentagon Papers leaks demonstrate, Ukraine is losing the war. So if Ukraine is losing and we refuse to have a compromise and a peace, then the only solution is to escalate. And that's why you'll see more weapons exports, you'll see more sanctions, but I do not think that they will have any meaningful impact, though, on the conflict.
Now, we will put the spotlight on that later on, but let's bring in Mr. DeBar from New York. Now, Dmitry Medvedev himself posted on his Telegram channel that this idea from the idiots, I'm quoting him, at the G7 about a total ban of exports to our country by default is beautiful, in that it implies a reciprocal ban on imports from our country, including categories of goods that are the most sensitive for the G7. Your comments, sir?
It's more than just the foods. We find out that although there are all these machinations about Russian petroleum products, natural gas, etc., that the Ukraine is importing gas and oil from Russia and profiteering at the same time, some of the senior officials. Also, things dealing with the nuclear power industry involve still an import chain from Russia, which Russia can just stop sending these things. Look, they've been miscalculating from the very beginning. And the problem is there's an institutional dysfunction. You have the intel agencies are supposed to operate as the brains, basically, to inform those that are making policy, first of all, what's going on in the world, what's a possible threat, and to give some advice. And then the civilian control of the intel and military that's supposed to exist in the United States, that existed, for example, back in the early 1960s until the assassination of President Kennedy. That no longer exists. Joe Biden, we're finding out still on a daily basis, was placed in office by the CIA. Now, the CIA, according to one of the presidential candidates, Democratic presidential candidate Bobby Kennedy, I interviewed on Friday, is a captive agency whose job is to provide, this is a quote from him, to provide the military contractors a constant pipeline of new wars. Now, although they have miscalculated about what sanctions would do to Russia and how quickly it would bring them to their knees, etc., what they have done very successfully is bring a war about that's extremely profitable for the military-industrial complex. And I think we have to look at the fact that we have a runaway train here whose sole purpose is to feed that pipeline, and that everything else that we're looking at and dealing with is subservient to it and at risk as a consequence.
Of course, we will have to discuss who is benefiting from the war and, of course, these sanctions as well. But in your opinion, why would the G7 come up with sanctions, suggesting sanctions that would go against the very principles of capitalist economy?
For me, they're taking their directions from Washington. And Washington is taking their directions from those who want to make war with Russia. You know, there is the policy objective of taking Russia down that has been a long, since before the Soviet Union was founded, the United States has wanted that. This was the primary goal of Hitler's Germany also. If you read Mein Kampf, he's very detailed about why Russia and the Soviet Union should be dismantled into constituent parts and exploited thoroughly because of the mineral wealth and the well-trained workforce there. This is an objective here. I mean, if you look at the fact that the U.S. destroyed Iraq and Libya to get the oil, and then consider how much oil there is in Russia, all by itself, forgetting everything else, you can see what's driving the policy ultimately. But in terms of the G7, they're taking instructions from the United States and those who make policy here, and their objective is to take Russia down. Actually, by the way, they're very clear about it. The State Department, for better than a year now, has been running seminars basically talking about decolonizing Russia, and by that they mean breaking it up into like 10 different countries.
Well, it's interesting that you should point that out. And in the meantime, as you mentioned so yourself, Mr. Don DeBar, and also our guest from Oslo, Professor Diesen, you both mentioned that Russia's economy quickly bounced back from those initial sanctions that were imposed last year. So, Professor Diesen, this question is addressed to you. Why would the G7 countries want to try a failed approach?
Well, sometimes sanctions can work more in the long term, and so the assumption is, if it hasn't worked yet, double down. This is what we do every time when something doesn't work. It's same with the weapons we sent. They're not changing the tide of the war, but again, we double down. More weapons, longer distance. Same with the sanctions. They're not working, so we're doubling down. More of the same. I think part of the reason is, as I mentioned before, there's no real alternative because what Russia has demanded is, again, what they demanded in December of 2021, which is they want less NATO on its borders. They want it to be rolled back. This isn't possible for the West and NATO, because NATO is an institution which is supposed to facilitate Western hegemony across the entire pan-European space. So this goes against the whole objective after the Cold War for more than 30 years now, to establish not just a Europe but a world order in which the collective West, under leadership of the United States, should dominate in every sphere. So this is why this conflict has become an issue of all or nothing for the West. Because this is seen as our last chance to really break Russia. What other opportunity will we have similar as this, when there's immense sanctions, a consensus for them? We're able to fight the Russians with Ukrainians, with hundreds of thousands of them fighting against Russia, as our proxies. This is an opportunity that won't come back. So I think. And the alternative is to make a compromise, and then we'll lose this so-called unipolar moment, this global primacy, which the entire security strategy of the West is premised on. So I think simply that this is the only thing that there's left. There's this. I don't think we see any other option but trying to win this, even though it's now becoming very, very obviously clear that it's not going to happen.
Exactly, as you mentioned yourself, Professor, it is becoming even more clear that this is not going to happen. You pointed to CIA documents also stating the same. Mr. Don DeBar also mentioned that. So the question is, of course, there are other alternatives, such as, for example, proposing a peace deal or starting negotiations on a peace deal. But let's also bring in Mr. Don DeBar here. NATO is expanding northward with the accession of Finland, perhaps later Sweden. Ukraine's bid to join the military alliance is also on the table. So why are they trying to provoke Russia? This was the initial reason why Russia started this military operation.
Yeah, let's look at this in historical context, and not just looking at the situation in 1989, although we will look at that. That's where the promise was made in exchange for Russia withdrawing from its partition section of Germany, allowing the reunification of Germany, but really the absorption of the Russian occupation zone into the essentially what the American occupation zone that had absorbed the British and French. The NATO at that time was supposed to not go any further east than the Elbe River, which was kind of one of the borders of East Germany, West Germany. And that means that the Warsaw Pact countries, Czechoslovakia, now Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, etc., these countries would not become NATO countries. There would be no U.S.-controlled weaponry moved any closer to Russia. That was supposed to be the deal. But actually, you have to go back to 1945 to look at what actually happened, because Europe at that time was partitioned between the U.S. And its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. And then in 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew from its occupation. In other words, not just from East Germany or the German occupation zone, but from all of the Warsaw Pact countries as well that it had occupied, because they were used as staging area for the invasion and near destruction of the Soviet Union, killing between 25 and 30 million people. And so when they withdrew, they anticipated at least the pacification of Western Europe, and perhaps even, I don't know if this was promised, but one would expect an eventual end to the U.S. occupation of Western Europe, which continues. And so that's the context for which they're looking at their security. And one last thing. We have all these weapon systems now, modern, high-speed weapon systems, where in the 1980s you had cruise missiles in West Germany that could reach Moscow in 12 minutes. We have faster weapons that are right up on the Russian border now with nuclear weapons. Go back to 1962, when the Soviet Union placed, I don't know, a couple dozen missiles, 1962-style weapons in Cuba, 90 miles away. The U.S. was ready to go to nuclear war, and it was only because the civilian control of the military and the intelligence agencies that all wanted the war refused to do it that we're still here. And now we have an entirely different condition where they face weapons on their borders that are turned on in war games and hot enough times, and no chance to respond, with massive amounts of weapons on both sides. We're in a very dangerous condition. And again, we do not have civilian control of the military or the intel agencies right now. Rather, the civilians are basically operatives of the intelligence agency.
Exactly. So, Professor Diesen, in your opinion, you of course did mention that this seems to be the last option for the G7, and that is why they're pushing for more sanctions and probably even more arms for Ukraine. But doesn't that simply defy the purpose? And we are seeing a new world order now emerging, with Russia strengthening its ties with countries in the Eastern Hemisphere.
Well, first of all, the purpose of sanctions is to create economic pain in order for the opponent to change its policies. So economic pain is usually not supposed to be an objective of its own. And given that Russia considers this to be an existential threat, it's very reasonable to believe that any economic pain they will ignore and absorb it in order to continue. But that being said, I don't think there's any. Well, it becomes almost silly now to pretend as if this is only about changing Russian policies. I think across the American leadership, as well as the British and others, it's been quite clear now that the objective is quite a lot wider. This is an effort to permanently weaken Russia, to knock out another great power. As a former retired General Kellogg said in the United States, this is a great war. You know, they can fight the Russians with Ukrainians and permanently weaken it, and the U.S. can then focus on China instead. So, but you're right with the sanctions. This is again also becoming an all or nothing. The idea is that if you can break Russia, then we can impose our conditions on them. They will sell us what we want. They will buy what we want from us, but instead we're seeing that not just Russia has lost all trust in the Western markets, but the rest of the world as well, getting very, very apprehensive. Across the world now, you see countries attempting to decouple from the dollar, not just attempting, quite successfully. This is gaining immense pace, not just the adversaries of the United States, but also its friends, its allies, from Turkey to India. Everyone is joining in because the trust in the United States to be this administrator, apolitical administrator of the international economic system, is gone. And that's just a reserve currency, which is immensely important. But we also see that the rest of the world now is not really that comfortable with relying on American technologies, relying on their industries as they keep disrupting the supply chains. They're no longer even trusting the transportation corridors. You know, what might they do, you know, to choke the Chinese economy, or will they, or as they're doing now, they're preventing, you know, Russian ships from operating. So it's across the board. It's all these different areas of economic connectivity and activity, in which there's very little trust now in the West. That, you know, and this is quite. Historically, it's not unique. Once you have a declining hegemon, it will use its dominant position over the international economy to try to prevent the rise of rivals. But in doing so, they only make it more imminent for the rest of the world to diversify away from their economic control. So I think this is again another doubling down for everything or nothing. So either the Western economies will continue to decline, the world will lose trust in it, or they're able to break Russia and kind of restore this unipolar moment of a global hegemony. You know, they will be able to break Russia. You know, the Chinese will get the message. Everyone will essentially bow their heads again. And we can go back to this ideal scenario of the 1990s when the world did everything that we asked it to.
That seems like a long-lost dream at this point, doesn't it?
Yes, I certainly think so. That's why I think I'm very critical of these policies, because I don't see it as being in our interest in any way. The world is already multipolar. That's evident by these sanctions. If it wasn't multipolar, in the unipolar area, we would have put the sanctions on Russia. There would have been nowhere else it could go. Now we see the world is multipolar. The rest of the world simply picks up whatever Russia wants to sell and sells Russia what we don't want to sell them. So the world has already changed. By failing to adapt to this multipolar world, by pretending it's still a unipolar one, we are weakening ourselves. So even if you don't care about the future of Russia and Russians, you would think that our national interest would be a high priority. But I think that the failure to adapt to this new distribution of power in the world is very stubborn, and it will bring more pain to us, I think, than the Russians.
Now, since you mentioned more pain, let's go back to what Dmitry Medvedev said. Mr. Don DeBar, what would the repercussions of terminating the Black Sea grain deal be? And will actually Russia follow through with that? Or is this just a rhetoric, you know, just to respond to that threat coming from G7?
The public relations presentation of the grain deal was that Russia needed to make the grain deal. This is what the West was saying, because those that were most affected by this were people in countries that needed food support, particularly in Africa, they were referring to. And as we've seen, the development of, well, the relationships that have developed over many years between Russia and the Soviet Union priorly and African states left a good foundation for what's happened recently. You had, on the one hand, the United States supporting colonial relations wherever they existed and stepping in some places where they hadn't existed. And, of course, the whole history of the transatlantic slave trade on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Soviet and Russian support for liberation movements. That was sort of the soil in which the most recent efforts of Russian diplomacy and Chinese diplomacy also have taken place. And so if it comes to a point where this grain deal is pushed aside because of the G7, Russia is poised certainly to make a direct contact with whatever nations need this. And they've already been doing debt forgiveness to some of the very same countries that need this grain. And as it turned out, we found out when the grain deal was operating, over the past year, the main beneficiary was Europe, the wealthier northern European countries, as a matter of fact, and not African countries that were having some issues with food. So I think the main beneficiary is going to be the people that need the food most, and Russia. And I think those that are going to suffer the most are going to be the people in Europe who've already suffered much of the fallout from the oil and energy problems that they've had, from their economies being stripped of the money that's being sent to the money laundry in Kiev, and, by the way, who are expressing their dissatisfaction in the streets in states of near rebellion in France, or perhaps even pre-revolutionary, the way it looks. And, the people are excited on the ground across the European landscape at the moment.
So, Mr. Don DeBar, how far do you see peace deal negotiations on a peace deal at this point?
You have a lot of complications here. Clearly, there are people that are driving this project that don't want peace. We saw them scuttle it last year, a year ago now in April. And we saw some of the people in the Kiev regime who were looking to make peace, one of them particularly being assassinated for his effort. Here, Joe Biden has not expressed any interest whatsoever. As a matter of fact, they're doing things that are unprecedented against just diplomatic efforts. Most recently, again, not issuing visas to the press corps following Foreign Minister Lavrov to the UN. I don't see U.S. interested in peace whatsoever, although it is the most essential thing for Americans that policy be followed. We can't afford to throw $150 billion every year at some other military project, one, by the way, that threatens nuclear war every time it's escalated, and that has no path other than escalation, as we heard, because it's disintegrating under their feet as they stand now. And, the next steps of escalation, and as they insanely suggest that they're going to incorporate Ukraine into NATO as part and parcel of the coming offensive, quote unquote, we're looking at escalation, meaning direct war between Russia and NATO. I don't know how long that can go on before there's an attack on the homelands of the NATO countries. Certainly, Russia can't allow a war on its border and inside its own borders to happen without retaliation, and they are well positioned to retaliate broadly against Europe and the United States. Very well situated.
Thank you very much, Mr. Don DeBar. Mr. Diesen, Professor Diesen, I'd like to wrap this up with your comments. So if you could please tell us, how far do you see any kind of peace negotiations at this point? We have less than a minute left.
Well, I think it all depends. I think many in the West have great hopes for this spring offensive of Ukraine, but when that turns out to be a failure, there might be more interest because we simply exhausted all alternatives. But again, we spent 7 years sabotaging the Minsk II agreement, which we recognized was the only path to peace. And then once this war began, we sabotaged efforts by Ukraine and Russia to find a peace agreement. So I remain skeptical, but the opportunities, if there is one, will be after this failed spring offensive.
So we are still going to have to wait for another failure before the Europeans, at least, come to their senses, apparently. Thank you very much, Professor Glenn Diesen, Professor of Political Science from the University of Southeastern Norway, joining us from Oslo, and Mr. Don DeBar, activist and commentator, joining us live from New York. Thank you very much to both of you gentlemen for sharing your thoughts and views with us on this edition of Spotlight. And thanks to all of you for watching this edition.